Well, good morning. I am so blessed to see folks here because you're going to love today's talk and learning more about Chuck Mintz, or Charles Mintz, as the professional name lists. Before that, Mike is playing some music in the background. If you could raise it up just a little, Mike. So tomorrow night Friday night at the bandstand is one of my favorite groups called Special Consensus. And normally they're a Hoover show, but we couldn't make the schedules work. And so I don't want you to think, oh, they're just a bandstand show and not go see them on Friday night. But they are dynamite. They're International Bluegrass Award winners and all. And so I think you'll really, really enjoy them. So a little plug for that. And also a plug for tomorrow morning. Jeanette Keaton will be here talking about fake versus fact, how disruption and disinformation have affected our lives and society and how we absorb news and all of that. So I think that'll be a real wonderful presentation tomorrow morning here at 10:30. But today's program is being presented by my newer friend. We've known each other about a year. Through one of those divine intervention serendipitous moments where Steve Ostro, who used to play for the symphony, told Chuck, well, if you want to go to Lakeside, talk to Shirley. He was working on a project of, are you talking about the Ohio Guide at all? Okay, so he'll talk about that a little later, but he came and did some photographs of Lakeside. Chuck will cover his background a little, but most notably he's worked on several different exhibitions, which is what he'll highlight today. Done extensive work with the ICA Art Conservation Organization in Cleveland, and has a strong commitment to that, to preserving and conserving photography. So hopefully you've had the chance to look through the exhibit a little in Hoover Lobby. If not, it will certainly be open this weekend, and so I encourage you to stop by. All that being said, I'd like to officially introduce, silence your cell phones, and please help me welcome Chuck Mintz.
Thanks, everybody. A few minutes ago, everybody was seated in the back. And so I was making, so I thought maybe the first 10 rows were like VIP only or something, but we'll get over it. How many of you have seen the exhibition at Hoover? Okay, that's fine. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to approach this project, because unlike most photography you will see in a gallery or an exhibition, the writing that comes with it is equally as important as the photographs. So you kind of can't look around, see a photograph that catches your eye, and read the story. You kind of just have to pick a spot and go with it. Sometimes the more ordinary photographs have some of the most compelling stories for reasons I don't understand. Anyway, and on the cover slide, I showed my three books. The first one was the album project, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, about my son who has autism. The second was Precious Objects, and the book, kind of like the exhibit, has a similar requirement, which is you got to read the stories. If you just thumb through and look at pictures, some of them are actually pretty good, but the stories make it happen for me, and I think for others. And the last book, Lustron Stories, published by Ohio State University Press. So that's my three books, and I figured on the cover slide I could, take opportunities for some shameless self-promotion, right? Because after all, why are we here, right? So a little bit about me. I'm trained as an electrical engineer and got a master's degree at Cleveland State. Actually, while I was living in Ann Arbor, which is sort of a long, boring, but interesting to me story. In my first career, we did big industrial control systems. So we designed the controls for steel mills and paper mills, film processing. We did a lot of work for Kodak. Ironically, Kodak would not let us into their facility. So we would train their techs. And I think occasionally some of our field people would get in, but when they built their facilities, they didn't want anybody seeing what was going on because it was, and in fact, the last big color film processing line they make is still being used to produce color film. And, and the reason they're still producing color film is the movie industry. There are film directors that insist on film. So there are, Fujifilm still makes some color films, but the Kodak films, which I used up until COVID, were only here because the movie industry kept them going. And so I left that career and wanted to get into a small business, so I went to work for a company. Come on in and have a seat. The first 10 rows are only for VIP. No, they're fine, anywhere you want to sit. And so we made plumbing hand tools that we sold at retail. So our biggest customers when I left them were Lowe's, but we sold through all the co-ops, Ace, True Value, those kind of guys. We sold a little bit to Home Depot. They were our biggest customers when I started, so it was sort of an up and down trip through contemporary retail. Not a picnic for anybody, but we had a great time. And I became a full-time photographer in 2008. So Shirley wanted to know how long it's been, and I was going, but it's on the slide. So even when I was a kid, I was sort of like interested in making pictures. My dad bought me a little brawny camera, and my dad was kind of a standard 1950s, 60s era camera bug. So, you know, he had bought a nice camera and would take 10,000 slides on vacation and then bore everyone, you know, senseless with them. But he loved it, and I sort of picked it up a little bit. And almost by happenstance, I attended a workshop at Maine Photographic Workshop in Rockport, Maine. It's now Maine Media Workshops, but back then it was Maine. And I had a great teacher. He was a Canadian landscape photographer. I had never heard of him before I spent the week there. He was one, you know, when I look back on my life, which I get a chance to do now a little bit, he was one of the great teachers in my life. And the experience changed my life. You were doing photography all the time. You were in a dorm situation with other photographers. You ate with other photographers after dinner. You had programs with I mean, you were doing it all the time. And it was literally it was an emotional experience. And so one of the things that Freeman said is if you only do this when you want to, you'll never be any good. And which obviously stuck with me. One of the other things he said was, even if you can't do this full time, you need to do it every week. So I had, you know, 10,400 hobbies because I get interested in almost everything I see, and I shed them all and would spend basically one morning every weekend out photographing for all that time. And I resolved that someday I'd become full-time. And it only took me 30 years. But they went fast, I suppose. In those 30 years, I made things that I would describe as the kind of anonymous landscape. So there were usually people in them, but they were not identifiable. So you could see people in the landscape, but you wouldn't know who it was. This is actually Cleveland. This is the lakeshore in Cleveland. Back before winters disappeared, but and you know they're ice fishing, and I think it's been a few years since you could ice fish right off the shore like that. But this was sort of typical of my work, and it's a good photograph. It's a good photograph. the problem becomes, another course I took when I was living in New Jersey with a fellow editing what was almost a mimeographed newsletter then, which is now this beautiful book that he publishes. But basically, this was in 1982, and photographers were already questioning the value of just taking good pictures. This was before cell phones, before Instagram, before the internet. But even then, more and more people were getting cameras. There were more and more great photographs published. And the photography world was sort of in transition because people were sort of abandoning the idea that everything had to be black and white, starting to embrace color in the art photography world. But there was this idea that if you just made nice pictures, that was great, but it wasn't really sufficient to really say anything about yourself in the work. So I woke up on January 1st, 2008 and said, okay, now I'm a full-time photographer. You know, what am I going to do now? And the first project I worked on was with my son. My son has autism, pretty classical. He's 49 years old, so it was a low incident disability back then. Now it's actually relatively common, and he had scoliosis surgery at 15. So that was in 1990. Do the math, Chuck. And we didn't know how to explain to him what was going on, because it was the first time in his life that we allowed him to get hurt. And so we said, what are we going to do? And came up with the idea of buying him a Polaroid Spectra camera. And he took to this camera and started producing these Polaroids at family events and parties and creating these albums that he's holding here, and that's all his work. That's all his work. And so for my first project, I said, why don't I do a project photographing my son holding his albums? And I called it creatively the Album Project, right? So there it is. And Alice, yeah, I said I had a friend named Alice. This was planned. The second picture from the left is by my friend Alice, who unfortunately is not with us. I'm sorry. But so that was part of my plan to meet an Alice here and tie it to this picture. And so I created these large, and this is the cover of the book, but in an exhibit, those photographs are 64 inches high. And the reason they're so big, there's a number of reasons they're so big. One is, so you could see the Polaroids as Polaroids. So you could read what he wrote, see the pieces of it, understand them, and recognize them as instant photographs. Because at the time, people would know what a Polaroid looked like versus something you did on Kodacolor or whatever. And also, I wanted him to have this plain background, because as many talents as he has, his world is different than ours. And so his reactions to things are often a mystery. And so it's hard to tell why he does things sometimes. He loved working on this project. And by loved working on the project, he had to do things that are uncomfortable. because I'm photographing in my studio, and these albums are reflective. So he had to hold them just right so they wouldn't reflect light. And he had to sort of stand still, and he had to not wear the kind of dumb grin that he was taught in elementary school he's supposed to wear when he has his picture taken, and he has this kind of picture. So he needed to do a lot of things, and he loved working on it. He never shows these albums to people on purpose. So he's just got them. But I would have copies of the book in my back seat in the hope that somebody would buy one. And if he was in the back on a trip or when we go, he would always pick the book up and leaf through it. So that, you know, my theory here is a little bit, and I'm going on and on about this project, but my theory here is a little bit that with people with disabilities, they're always being told what to do. And they very rarely feel like they're working with somebody as opposed to for somebody. And so that's him. And so the other project I did about the same time is foreclosed homes in every neighborhood where I ever lived. And there are 12 of them. And there are 2 photographs printed on canvas of foreclosed homes, a foreclosed home in the neighborhood where I lived. The only one that actually is my home was the house I grew up in, which was the second one in the series. And I was there, not from birth, but pretty close to when I was about 13. So it was important, and it had the HUD sticker in it and all that. And so there are 2 of these photographs on canvas. One is screwed to the back of these pieces of plywood. These are 4x8 sheets of plywood. And the other is made into a window shade that pulls down over it. So in a gallery, you have to pull the shade down and up to see the picture behind it, which of course violates all the rules of being in a gallery. You're not supposed to touch the artwork and all that. The other thing is, most of the people in here are old enough to remember roller shades. You know, if you let go of them just wrong, they would do the kind of thing. Or if you pulled it too far, then you'd kind of have to like jiggle it. And of course, in the gallery, that would happen, and people would be massively embarrassed. It was a fun project. I'm wearing my Cleveland Public Theater T-shirt today, and I did a project of actors in costume and in their homes for Cleveland Public Theater, and created triptychs. And these are relatively large. They're 24 by 56. And it was kind of, and the concept was, you know, I wonder, you know, what actors look like, you know, what do actors' home look like as opposed to being on stage. Now, public theater is not Broadway, so the costumes and sets are pretty modest. One of the things that come out of this is partly because they're actors, so they're showing you how they want to look, even in these settings. And there's kind of these tension things. Now, Carly, she's in her parents' kind of den that I think her dad built on the back. Carly's a vegetarian. So she looks like she's perfectly in place, but you can bet that at some point she looked at Dad's dead deer heads and kind of went, not so great. Yeah. This young man was living, he's part of this summer program, one of the summer programs that Public Theater does. And Malcolm he was like 6 feet tall. He was a big high school kid. And so I go to the door and his mom's there. And his mom is like 5 feet, you know, maybe 90 pounds. But it's like, Malcolm, why'd you wear that jacket? You know, Malcolm, you gotta go call me. Hey, she was being a mom, right, of a teenage kid. And, you know, and Malcolm was like, okay, mom, okay, mom. And then the next project is the one that we have here precious objects. And for reasons kind of semi-unknown, that's my son on the cover, kind of holding his toy leopard from when he was a kid, kind of the same way he held the pictures in the album project. So I kind of was intrigued by the tie. He's an obsessive hand washer, so you can see what his hands look like when you wash your hands 18 times a day. So now I'm going to give you the secret to appreciating this project, at least my secret. So some of this is not brilliant insight, but you want to look at how things appear, how the writing appears, the dress that people chose. I didn't tell people what to do. Basically, I had people stand at a bench usually and write the statement on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Some people wrote it incredibly carefully. Some people scratched things out. It was fine because we wanted to get kind of the heart of people's, let people speak rather than me speak. And the only other comment I made here is that most of the ones I chose reference somebody else in the people's lives. So a lot of the ones that you see in the exhibit or in the book, that what's precious about it is how people came to get it. And ultimately in this project, that became more and more important to me. And in some cases, people that had been only kind of, I'd met once kind of people, became kind of friends over time, and so there's stories that evolved out of that. So the first one I did was of Chen, who is an artist friend of mine, and she actually did the videos on the album project website that I was told don't work. And she said, is it okay to take the paper home and write my statement at home? And normally I'm kind of like, because when people say, don't worry, trust me, I'll get this stuff back to you, you're not their first priority, people forget. But my idea was, for this project, when I put it together, was to do this, to use this, to shoot in my studio. This was 8 by 10 inch film. So these films are big. And because I used 8 by 10 inch films, I could enlarge things a lot. So I was going to make these composites where the object got big like this, and you saw the portrait, and you saw the statement, and in the background, I would show some sort of contemporary version or commercial version of the same thing. So I was sneaking into department stores and photographing perfume counters until some clerk would come up to me and say, can I help you? And I go, oh, no, and I'd get out of there. And then I read what Chen had wrote and thought about it and thought about what she'd done and basically decided that my original idea of putting things together was really not very bright, and that these stories speak for themselves and they don't need my interference. What I learned later is it's part of Chinese culture that handwriting, good handwriting and penmanship is sort of an expectation for women. And Chen is plenty feminist enough, but she was raised in a culture and she expressed it here. So this was sort of a pathway to understanding things And I don't have a bigger version of the writing here, but this is Loli. She's a photographer I'd met once at a show in Dallas, and she was going to be in town, and I said, you know, can you participate? And she said yes. And I would not read what people wrote until after. So I'd do the photography, and they'd write it, and I'd thank them, and we might, you know, have something to eat or drink, but I wasn't going over people's stuff while they were there. So I didn't know what she wrote. And I think it's legible, but these are letters from her mother. And her mother died in Loli's childbirth. And I was really struck by that. And when I talk about the other person, right, you know, you start to think about the person that's not in the picture, right? And I learned from Loli later that her mother was a Holocaust survivor and escaped the camps after liberation, immigrated to Israel, and got married and pregnant and died in her childbirth. So there's a story there that, you know, is almost a movie, right? I mean, with a really tough ending, except Loli's wonderful. So, you know, there's good and bad in these things. So what's going on with this stuff? As I got more and more into things, I started to develop a pattern of working, which is I take an idea, whether it's precious objects, which is, and we'll talk more about the project later, or Lustron, there's sort of an interesting story behind it. And I'll go over more stories, and then I start doing the work. And I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know whether graphically I'm going to be able to do something with it. Sometimes the pictures are so disparate that you know they don't make sense together in a way. Sometimes they're not, you know, and then how you're going to present it, and more importantly, am I feeling something here? Am I seeing something in these pictures that I can relate to as a person? Is there something coming out of here that's more than an interesting story about steel houses or people talking about things that are important to them? Is there something more going on? And so it kind of comes full circle to now the idea isn't the cool story, it's kind of the emotional story that I get. Now the truth is, I don't tell people what to see or what to look for, but the fact that I can see a story is enough for me to go forward with it and at least show it to people and begin to see whether they kind of are able to understand what I've done. So when we talk about precious objects, and the concept there, the original idea was something people have had a long time that has special meaning and they would not replace if they lost it. So it had to be a thing, so it couldn't be your doggy or your grandchildren or whatever. And it had to not be something you'd replace. So it really can't be your bicycle that you love to ride or your tablet or whatever you got. Some people kind of said, no, I really want to do this anyway. Okay. One of the exceptions I made is that I tended to discourage people from bringing family photographs. Because what I didn't want is an exhibit with 175 people with the same object, for one thing. And for another thing, it's sort of a common idea that your family photographs, if you ever dig through that box, you know, are important to you. One of the people I photographed was Leo. And Leo's daughter was a friend of mine, and she's a photographer. And so Linda brought Leo to my studio. And Leo, I think, was 93 at the time, and was starting to have problems. And he had brought these photographs of building the house for his family. And I thought that was a little different than, here's, grandma and grandpa at their wedding kind of thing. And so, I kind of liked that. I thought it stood out. As I said, I would have people stand at a little work table in my studio to write things. And Leo was not really strong enough to stand there and do it. So I sat at my desk. My desk is white. So it was white paper on a white desk. Leo kind of wrote a little bit on my desk as well as the paper. His daughter was apoplectic. It's like, Linda, Dad, it's Linda. He's fine. He really is expressing himself here, and I'm perfectly happy with it. So, these are the kind of things that I take out of it. What you take out of it, you take out of it when you look at it. And everybody sees different things in these stories. The next major project I want to talk about is this one. And I've done a lot of work with what used to be the Ohio Historical Society, is now the Ohio History Connection in Columbus. I exhibited the foreclosure project in a gallery there. I actually photographed for Precious Objects at the center. So these people have been kind of supportive of me over the years. And they had a sort of a scholarly magazine they published that they no longer publish. And it was all about Lustron Corporation. And Lustron, between 48 and 50, manufactured porcelain enamel-coated steel houses in Columbus. And they were shipped on a special trailer in pieces in reverse order that they needed to be assembled, and were assembled by local contractors that were contracted with the company on a plain concrete slab. So, they were mostly in the eastern US. There was a couple in Colorado, there was one in Los Alamos, but pretty much all over the east. Obviously, more of them as you get closer to Ohio than further, because the truth is that in 1948, taking a semi-truck over, there was no I-75, right? I mean, over two-lane highways through every small town. And because it was a specialized trailer, they couldn't do anything with it on the way back. So they not only had to drive it to Kansas or Minneapolis, they needed to drive it back. And, for those of us that sometimes get off the freeways to see the countryside, it's wonderful, but it's really slow. And even the two-lane highways weren't as nice as they are now, right? And but they built 2,500 houses. About 2/3 of them are remaining. And one of the first, and so I would enter juried exhibitions. So I would be in a group show, and I would go to the place to meet the people and try to convince them to show my work and be interested in my work. And at the same time, we'd photograph for these projects. So I was in a juried show in Joplin, Missouri, and this is Kansas City. And this is one of the first ones don't do that, Chuck. This is the first one I did. This is Richard, I call him Richard the Collector. He was a retired Boilermaker for the Santa Fe Railroad. And he's one of those guys you can't quite tell how old he is. And he said, I don't want you photographing inside because I have my collections in there. But I'd love to show you my collections and we can do the photographs outside. So we go in, and he has, you know, the aluminum cake forms that you use for kids' birthday cakes, you know, baseball mitts and that kind of stuff. He had a collection of those. He had like every kind of pen he ever made. He had some VHS tapes. He said, now this was a while ago. You know, you can't get those anymore. It's like, and he was really happy with where he was and what he was doing. And he said, you know, his family kind of goes, you know, Richard, you know, you shouldn't be living alone, and why you know, all this stuff. And Richard said, I like doing it, and I'm happy with it. And he said, and so he goes into stuff, and he pulls out this Thomas Kincaid plate. And Thomas Kincaid, it's a little quiet now, but he was sort of an industry, you know, kind of a sort of easy to approach with, you know, kind of inspirational sayings. And he, you know, you'd get these souvenir plates, and eBay's full of them. And apparently they didn't turn out to be the great investments they were, you know. But he was like every once in a while, an artist comes along and turns it into a real industry, and he's one of them. And Richard wanted me to have this plate. It was just the sweetest thing. And he was not the only person in the project that gave me things. But as soon as I was done with Richard, I knew this was a project I was going to continue on. This is Miles and Terrence, and this is one of the few things. Oh, we're still on Richard? Oh. Okay. This is Miles and Terrence. This is one of the few lustrons that was actually in a city. And he's on the northern border of Detroit, which culturally is one of the strangest places on earth, because it's the inner city. And it's kind of a nice street. There's like a canal that goes behind the houses and stuff. But it's Detroit, and it's pretty thoroughly impoverished. Again, this street was one of the nicer ones. You go one block north, you're in the Grosse Pointes, which are the wealthiest suburbs in the country. So it's this kind of, so if you get lost, you probably want to get lost in Grosse Pointe, because, or maybe not, but this is Miles and his young son Terrence inside one of these houses. And the beauty of this project is I photograph people all over the country who all essentially lived in the same house. So you see that bookcase? And same bookcase, very different place, right? But it's the same house. And I like this picture because I'm in it. You know, but you can get a sense of it. So when I exhibit that stuff, the frames are 30 by 39. They're fairly large, and they're made out of the same material the houses were made out of. I found a guy in Tennessee who for a company that makes things out of porcelain and enamel, and he said, "Yeah, we'll do this," and you know, which those are two separate things, right? Because somebody agreeing to do a very small run of custom stuff. It was wonderful. And so when we first exhibited this in Louisville, I was more excited about the frames than I was about the pictures. It's like, these are so cool, and everybody's going on with this guy. And this is the stuff that old bathtubs used to be made out of. And I remember my mother had a roaster made out of it, and you'd get little chips, and you'd see the black primer behind them. And it was a common way to put a rugged coating on steel in the late 40s and 50s before powder coating came along, 10 years later, 1962, whatever. The next thing I did was conventional hardware stores. And again, all over the country, this was also with 8x10 film. And this is Ellis Hardware in Oakland. And it's an inner city hardware store, so you can kind of see things. Actually, you can see just about anything in there. I mean, there's everything from rat poison to snacks in this picture, and signs and paint and razor wire and lanterns and hats and toilet plungers. I mean, this is sort of the classic idea of an old hardware store. This one's in a suburb of Cleveland, actually very close to where I lived when I was in high school, and he's still, you know, successful with this hardware store, partly because it's most of the houses in the neighborhood go back to the late 40s, but there are other older neighborhoods that go back usually to the 20s and 30s, but a lot of them had, you know, stuff in them, hinges, that kind of stuff that, you know, you can't go to a home center to fix. And people that need help still go to a hardware store. Yeah. This is Cedar Center Hardware in South Euclid. It's east of Cleveland. South Euclid is not quite an inner ring suburb, but it's like it's very close. And so these are the hardware stores. And again, I like to print these big because it's big sheets of film and there's all this stuff. So, you know, there's one of these in my living room and I still kind of get lost in it because there's still stuff that I haven't seen. And then the last project I did before COVID was Carnegie Libraries. Another amazing story. Andrew Carnegie, who J.P. Morgan said to him, you know, how's it feel to be the richest man in the world? And J.P. Morgan probably knew, since he arguably might have been the richest man in the world too. Carnegie funded 2,700 public libraries. Most of them, 1,800 in the US, with virtually no requirements to the community, other than the community agree to taxpayer tax funding to operate and support the library. So these things are in big cities, and this is Goldendale, Washington. This town was so small, I couldn't even find it. And I mean, I'm in looking at, you know, prefab homes and stuff, and then you go one block over and there's a library. And so towns with a church, a gas station, and a live public library, still operating, still important. And at the other end, New York City has a lot of them. I photographed in Washington, D.C. The library closest to me in Cleveland is this one. It's kind of around the corner from my house in west side of Cleveland. So it's just amazing that we have this public institution that, you know, many people say, yeah, I remember going to the library, but they're still full of kids, they're still a safe place to go, and there are still some kinds of research that are a lot easier to do with a librarian at your side than sitting at a computer. When I did the foreclosure project, this was before the internet was quite where it was, but I used census tracts to get demographic information about every one of the places in the time, 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980, you know, they were over a period of time. And the census books that come out every 2 years don't follow the same census, same format. So the 1950 census is not organized the same way the 1960 census is. So it's a bit of a puzzle to get things like median family income. So I go up to the desk and I'm kind of asked for these things. And the librarian says, do you need help with that? And I went, and she said, I love looking through census books. And I was like, okay. So, but that's a place where a library can do things that you can sit on the internet forever and try to figure out what the median family income in you know, Highland Heights, Ohio was in 1960. Who knows? The project I'm working on now, and there have been other in between, there have been a lot I started, and then didn't get that feeling from and then stopped. The project I'm working now on is based on the Ohio Guide. The Federal Writers Project published state driving guides that were put together during the Depression. So basically, these were WPA writers and photographers that wrote and illustrated these driving guides. And so this is from a 642-page driving guide. You know, in 1940, it's like, who was, you know, doing auto tours of Ohio in 1940, right? And worse during the Depression. And the Depression wasn't quite over, but things were getting better in 1940. But you got into the height of the Depression, and of course, a year later, the war started, and you couldn't get gasoline. So the utility of a driving guide, sort of classic WPA. On the other hand, there's these wonderful artifacts that talk about places, and there's not a lot of proportionality between how well known these places are now, and how much attention they got in these books, and so I want people in my photographs. So I've been picking these places for kind of two vectors, actually three. One is, am I going to be near the place so I don't have to drive all the way there, depending on where in Ohio it is. Secondly, can I get somebody to agree to be in the pictures and allow me to do it, which is often not easy, but it was easy here because Steve put me to Shirley, and Shirley said sure, and then she gave me about as thorough an opportunity at Lakeside as possible, and did a lot of, spent a whole afternoon here, right? We spent a lot of time, it was great, met a number of people and photographed a number of people. And it's David. And you know, I'm going to assume everybody kind of knows David, but David's a pretty special guy and kind of the local historian, right? So, and a bit of sort of, a charmer, So, I hope I caught that. This is the state fairgrounds. So, this is the state fair and the famous, butter cow, and with Tom Edison in the corner. I actually photographed Edison's birthplace in Milan, and I photographed Edison's sister's great-great-great-grandson there, which is, I always, kind of wonder whether, because it's so cool to be whether anybody cares, but it's just, I love these connections. This is Taborville, and Taborville got almost a page. And Taborville is kind of east of Cleveland, a bit in the exurbs, if you know where Chagrin Falls is. It's a little bit south and west of it. And Taborville was a, what's happening here? Oh, yeah. Taborville was a Czech cottage community, sort of organized around physical fitness. So they had this massive program of gymnastics and the like. And in my first career, they have a retirees picnic. It's, kind of these strange coincidences. In Taborville, there's like a little clubhouse, and the sign says Taborville. And if you Google Taborville, you actually takes you to this kind of loop with like 20 houses in it and a little lake and this clubhouse. And so Google knows about it, but I didn't know about it. Friends of mine that live over that way, most of them didn't know about it. And I'd been there, and I always sort of wondered, what's Taborville? And I'm going through the Ohio Guide, and I was meeting with somebody in Columbus at the History Center. And so I figured I better read some of this before I go on a meter, and I just pick out the Route 422 from the PA border to Cleveland, and Taborville pops up. And they apparently had an international gymnastics competition they sponsored there. There's still a club. I was the youngest guy in the room, but there's still a club that kind of descendants of people that do this. This is Alan, whose grandfather built the cottage here. And Alan was kind enough to let me photograph there, and some others. And I worked there a couple of summers actually, photographing. And but the guy who kind of coordinated this all for me, he gave me the tour, and apparently the president of Czechoslovakia in 1936 visited Taborville. Now think about the history of Czechoslovakia in the 30s, but it's one of these places where that just gets lost. I actually did I don't do assignment work, but I did a couple for the members magazine for the History Center. And they sent me to another place that was on here called Selleryville, which is south of here and is a center for high-value crops. So they grow things like asparagus and things that that you're not going to grow on 5,000 acres in Nebraska, but things that. And I think their biggest customer is Myers. But now it's like, I think there are like 3 or 4 families that own all of these farms now. And the borders of them are all chopped up because they were put together from farms that had been collected. And it was swampland, and it was settled by people they brought in from Michigan of Dutch heritage, thinking they could conquer the water. And they did, and so they've got this little kind of, what used to be called truck farms, but these now are pretty big operations. So I photographed in Selleryville. So that's the Ohio Guide, and that's what brought me here, and why I'm here today. So thank you.
Well, needless to say, your life is fascinating, and I was trying to take a picture into your brain as to how you come up with some of these concepts, because all of them are intriguing. Lustron homes, I didn't realize the insides were all metal too. I don't know why I didn't think about that, but I always knew the outsides, but I never thought about the insides, and I'd never been in one. But the precious objects, and the project you did, was it in Cleveland with the high school the kids age 5 to 14?
Yeah, at Rainey Institute. It's a after school. It's on East 55th Street in Cleveland, which is in
Rough place.
Cleveland, and it's an after-school arts program. And I was telling Shirley how wonderful the 5-year-olds were, and how difficult the 14-year-olds could be, right? It was like,
yeah.
But they're just kids, right? I mean, they're just kids, and it was funny. I did a little yearbook for them of the graduates one time, and so I'm photographing them one at a time, and they're kind of in their auditorium in a corner, and a group of kids come in, little tiny kids. And I'd been there working for a lot. I was there on and off for a couple of years. And 2 little girls come up, and they want to hug me. And, and I'm really careful about other people's children, right? It's like, okay, you guys can hug me, it's fine. I mean, I was using the wooden camera for part of it, for these portraits. And if I was photographing somebody, I'd say, do you want to see what it looks like through the back of the camera? And I would always ask, is it okay for me to lift you? Because you just got to respect the fact that kids, they're fragile. You gotta protect them. So, but it was a fun project.
I want to congratulate you on using the large format cameras, the 8x10, because that is a huge amount of work and expense. I use it in college, as a project in the style of Edward Weston, who used an 8x10
Yeah.
camera.
I wish I could do what Edward Weston did, but that's okay.
Well, yeah, he was pretty focused on green peppers and some other things.
Yeah,
But,
and his wives and girlfriends.
yeah, right, in Mexico. Secondly, Lustron. There is a Lustron house in our community in Gahanna, Ohio, which is owned, I think, by the school board, and they're just letting it sit. So you've given me a little bit of inspiration to like rattle their cage about maybe doing something with it.
Wait, have him buy a book at least. So, and I thought you were going to say there's actually a Lustron at Chautauqua in New York.
Is there?
Yep, one of the properties there is a Lustron home. It's owned when I did it by a family in Denver that comes to Chautauqua, New York in the summer. Yeah, where they set up as an exhibit. Yeah, I exhibited while that was up. It was like a multi-year project in the 50s they did, and so they assembled it there.
There is also one in Fort Wayne, Indiana, too.
Yeah, I've done a couple in Fort Wayne.
Great. In your Precious Objects exhibit, could you say a little bit more about the gentleman who was holding his father's false teeth? That was very catching.
That might be my favorite of the whole project. A friend of mine said, "Would you like to photograph on Long Island?" And I said, "Sure." So she set up 2 sessions, one in Hempstead at the African American Museum, which is where I photographed Travis with his inmate card from prison, and another east of there, a fairly famous town, starts with an M that I forgot. And Travis and Robbie were complete strangers. There was just a sign-up sheet, and he came, and he brought his father's. Apparently, he keeps his father's false teeth in a bell jar on his desk. And and his statement basically said, "I didn't get to talk much with my dad when he was around, but now I forget what he says, but I think of him," or whatever. And that really struck me, because no matter what your relationship was with your family, you almost always feel like, I wish I could have talked to them more when I could have. And so the kind of universality of this very strange thing, just absolutely, I loved it. And so it's the last piece in the book, and that's because I just think it's just a lesson that every kid will never learn, but ought to,
Chuck, a question. When you finished the Precious Objects photography, have you ever exhibited all the portraits at one time? Because aren't there 127?
No, there was 175.
175.
And the problem with that is people would never pay attention, right? I mean, getting people to go through and kind of properly look at 20 is almost a lot to ask. I mean, I've done some filmmaking, and the difference between still photography and filmmaking is when you do filmmaking, you're controlling time. It's extremely stressful, because generally, if you make a 5-minute film, people will watch it, and if you make an 8-minute film, people won't.
Wow.
And it's like, so when you edit still photographs, you aren't controlling the time quite like that, but you're still recognizing that. The other thing is, there's a lot of similar stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that's less personal than other things. And I really was stricken by, even Robbie and his teeth, as funny and as goofy as it is, it's a story you wouldn't necessarily share with a stranger, right?
Thank you. Yes. We can make arrangements for them to be on. Right now, they'll be before the show in Hoover on Friday I'm Saturday, and church on Sunday. But Kiris is in the back. Kiris, do you want to come down and mention the hours? Kiris is the one that hung the exhibit and is managing the opening reception and all. So, bravo, Kiris.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So, as Shirley mentioned, Saturday before the show, we'll have it open the full half hour before the show, and then on Sunday before church, and then also from 2 to 4 as well. And then we'll post some fall hours shortly as well.
I would guess if you have folks that are visiting and interested, if you put a call, leave a message for Kiris at the desk, we can even open the door and flip on the lights for you to go independently of that. But we really want as many people to see it as possible. So please let us know. Joyce.
You said you worked with students 5 to 14. Have you ever attempted to do the precious object experiment or any with them?
With kids?
With kids.
I did have some kids participate, and it didn't work out right. I did another project at the Cleveland Music School settlement. I've been taking my son to music therapy every week for 40 years. Anyway.
You're a great dad. You really are.
No, I'm old. It's a whole different thing. But I wanted to photograph kids and adults with a relationship to the settlement. So I would photograph them, and then I would have them generally either speak and do an audio or write, but more often speak in that project about why they're interested in music. And what happened with the project is the kids' pictures were wonderful, and their statements were like, "I really like doing lesson book number 2." The adults' pictures were awful, because everybody knows how they're supposed to look holding their flute, right? So it looked like the lobby of a theater, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there's nothing fun about it. Their stories were wonderful, and and so finally and of course it's a lot of work getting people to volunteer for things, and so finally I kind of went, this was fun, but it's not working. So that's an example of a project didn't work.
Chuck, are there any other brilliant ideas you had that you thought would be perfect and then they quickly turned out not to be?
Well, that was pretty brilliant, and it wasn't. During COVID, because getting volunteers seemed foolish, a friend of mine is on the board of Woodland Cemetery. It's an old cemetery in Cleveland. And they have a father and son photography team that ran a studio in the late 19th century, right in the center of Cleveland, right near Public Square. And so I kind of liked the idea of photographing, not re-photographing things they'd done, because they would make stereo cards. And rather than put the same thing in the stereo card, I would photograph kind of the place and maybe with more people in it. And that was also a good project where I didn't need to get volunteers, right? And yet, visually people just never quite got it. And it's a pretty standard student thing to have somebody take a 100-year-old photograph and then take the same place and photograph it again. And so I didn't see that as interesting, and then so it didn't work. So I did a project on the electrical grid, and I don't know your experience, but we really got hit hard by that storm that came through a couple weeks ago. And the electrical grid is visible all around you, particularly in the city, but in the suburbs. there's substations and there's transformer things and there's wires and there's electrical grid stuff everywhere that we don't even see because we just drive it past. And I thought that would be interesting. And when I was all done, it's like, looks like wires. I don't know. And
I got nothing.
so there have been a number of them.
Other questions or comments to share? What's next?
Well, the Ohio Guide, I'm continuing to work on that. It has not really come together yet, but it's I'm still unearthing fascinating stories, and I'm trying to figure out how to tie things together. Because in Taborville, I mean, I photographed kids doing gymnastics, and that's great, but when you show somebody, on a parallel bar, and you show somebody standing in front of a clavinet in a historical museum, visually you're kind of looking, going, what is this stuff? So that's one that I'm giving more time, and frankly, since 3 months ago when my hip decided to go south for the winter, but I'm going to keep at it.
Chuck very graciously offered to come, or agreed to come, knowing he'll have his hip replacement tomorrow. So I know Joyce has been through one, maybe some others, but bravo to you for hauling all the way from Cleveland, getting here.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any more questions?
Chuck will be here for a few minutes afterwards. There are a couple copies of the Precious Object book. If you're interested, we have a credit card machine, or he can certainly take cash. And but otherwise, help me and think again, Chuck, for this great presentation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.